On a winter dawn, at the turn of the 16th century, Niccolò Machiavelli entered Senigallia as Florence's envoy. The streets were hushed beneath the steel glint of helmets, awaiting Cesare Borgia, the duke whose reputation marched ahead of his banners. From a high window, Machiavelli watched the rebel captains arrive unarmed to greet the duke. Courtesy framed the first words, yet the air tasted of iron and betrayal. In minutes the doors clapped shut, pikes crossed the passage, and men were seized with theatrical precision. Machiavelli's pulse rose, not from fear, but from clarity. Politics stood stripped before him, the calculus that moves before the adversary does. When Cesare emerged, he walked as if redrawing the map. Machiavelli noted, "Fortune serves those who prepare the ground." Many would call the scene cruelty. To him it was instruction. States live when rulers master timing, loyalty falters, and order is born of decision. Later, writing of virtue and fortune, he did not retell the night. He distilled it into thought, and the thought has never slept since. Hi there. Welcome to Bioworld Legends. Here we tell people's stories. Subscribe now, we've got new videos every day just for you. I'm William, and I'm about to tell you this incredible story. Chapter 1. From 1469 to 1497, Childhood, Education, and First Steps in Florence. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence on May 3, 1469, into a city that pulsed as the intellectual and artistic heart of the Italian Renaissance. Florence at that time was both a cradle of beauty and a crucible of conflict. Great families like the Medici, the Pazzi, and the Strozzi struggled for dominance, and the republic swayed constantly between freedom and tyranny. The young Machiavelli grew up surrounded by this tension between ideal and reality, art and ambition. His father, Bernardo di Niccolò Machiavelli, was a jurist with limited means but deep intellectual curiosity. Though the family was not wealthy, Bernardo owned a small library, a rare treasure for a household of modest status. There, young Niccolò found the works of Cicero, Livy, and Dante. Those ancient voices, blending philosophy and politics, would shape his mind forever. His mother, Bartolomea di Stefano Nelli, brought warmth and stability, balancing her husband's scholarly discipline with compassion and faith. As a child, Machiavelli received a traditional humanist education. He studied grammar, rhetoric, and logic, subjects that formed the foundation of civic life in Florence. His first teacher is believed to have been Paolo da Ronciglione, a respected scholar of Latin literature. Niccolò quickly distinguished himself through sharp observation and eloquence. He wasn't drawn to abstract speculation, but to the ways in which ideas shaped real behavior. Florence during his youth was both glorious and fragile. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, ruled the city with unmatched political skill. Under his guidance, Florence became the beacon of Renaissance culture, home to artists like Botticelli and Michelangelo. Yet beneath the marble facades and poetic ideals lay a city of intrigue, where power was maintained as much through manipulation as through art. In this environment, Machiavelli's fascination with human behavior deepened. He often accompanied his father to court, listening to arguments, watching alliances form and dissolve, and learning how words could command as much power as swords. He absorbed everything, the gestures of judges, the rhetoric of lawyers, the pride of merchants, and the murmurs of the common people in the piazza. As he matured, Florence changed. The death of Lorenzo de' Medici in 1492 left the city without its steady hand. His son, Piero de' Medici, lacked his father's prudence and became increasingly unpopular. At the same time, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola rose to prominence. Preaching repentance and moral reform, Savonarola captivated the city with his apocalyptic sermons. He condemned the corruption of the clergy and the vanity of Florentine society, calling for the bonfire of the vanities, where citizens burned their luxuries and artworks in the piazza. Young Machiavelli, then in his early 20s, watched this transformation closely. He saw how faith could become a political force and how collective emotion could overturn governments. He didn't share Savonarola's religious fervor, but he understood the friar's power over the crowd, a lesson that would echo throughout his later writings. By 1494, Italy itself was in turmoil. The French king Charles VIII invaded the peninsula, claiming the Kingdom of Naples. His march southward destabilized every Italian state. Florence, caught between fear and opportunity, expelled the Medici family and declared itself a republic once again. For the young Machiavelli, this was the dawn of a new era. The restoration of the Florentine Republic opened possibilities for talented men outside the aristocracy. Machiavelli, educated, observant, and ambitious, began to move among the city's intellectual and political circles. Though he had no official post yet, his keen insight into human nature and his growing network among scholars and politicians made him a familiar figure in the city's civic life. He studied Roman history with renewed intensity, drawn to Livy's descriptions of the Republic's rise and fall. Ancient Rome, to him, offered a mirror for modern Florence, a people striving for liberty, torn between virtue and ambition. This historical perspective would later form the backbone of his political philosophy. By the mid-1490s, Florence was exhausted by uncertainty. Savonarola's rule had turned from idealism to repression. The friar's vision of a city of God clashed with the reality of economic hardship and foreign pressure. When Savonarola was executed in 1498, Florence was once again adrift, searching for stability amid chaos. Machiavelli stood at the threshold of his public life. His education, his understanding of rhetoric, and his talent for negotiation positioned him perfectly for service to the Republic. Yet what truly set him apart was his realism. While others clung to ideals, he sought to understand how things truly worked, the motives, the fears, and the ambitions that drove men and governments alike. As historian Roberto Ridolfi wrote in The Life of Niccolò Machiavelli, from the start, he was a student of men, not merely of books. That, more than anything, defined the path ahead. Florence was about to call him into its service. The Republic, fragile and uncertain, needed minds capable of navigating diplomacy, war, and intrigue. And Machiavelli, shaped by a youth of observation and curiosity, was ready to enter the theatre of power that would define the rest of his life. Chapter 2. From 1498 to 1502, Rise in the Florentine Republic and First Political Missions. When the fiery sermons of Girolamo Savonarola faded and the smoke of his execution drifted above Florence in 1498, the city entered yet another fragile experiment in republican government. The Medici had been expelled once more, and Florence stood exposed, its ideals lofty but its stability uncertain. It was in this volatile moment that Niccolò Machiavelli began his career in public service, a post that would open to him the inner workings of diplomacy, strategy, and the psychology of power. At 29 years old, Machiavelli was appointed second chancellor of the Florentine Republic. The position may have seemed administrative, but in truth it placed him at the center of the city's political machine. The second chancellery handled foreign affairs, official correspondence, and the delicate art of negotiation among Italian states. Florence, weakened by internal divisions and external threats, desperately needed sharp minds to navigate the shifting alliances that defined the Italian peninsula at the turn of the 16th century. Machiavelli's early duties involved drafting diplomatic letters, preparing reports, and organizing missions to neighboring states. But the Republic's leaders soon recognized his unusual talent for analysis and persuasion. He combined clarity of expression with a rare psychological insight. He understood not only what men said, but what they feared and what they truly desired. The new Florentine Republic was a fragile construct. It aspired to restore civic virtue and collective freedom, but lacked the stability and resources of the Medici regime. The government was dominated by the Great Council, a body of several hundred citizens modelled loosely on Venetian institutions. But its decisions were often slow, paralysed by debate. Outside the city walls, powerful neighbours watched and waited. Milan, under Ludovico Sforza, pursued its own ambitions. The Papal States, under the cunning Pope Alexander VI, sought to extend their influence through his son, Cesare Borgia, and France, under the newly crowned Louis XIV, maintained troops across northern Italy. In this landscape of intrigue, Machiavelli learned the language of power, not from theory, but from experience. His first major diplomatic assignment came in 1499, when he was sent to negotiate with the rulers of Pisa, a rebellious city that had declared independence from Florence. It was a test of patience and strategy. The mission failed to restore Florentine control, but Machiavelli's composure under pressure impressed his superiors. More importantly, it taught him that diplomacy without force was often little more than rhetoric. Back in Florence, Machiavelli observed the growing frustration of the Republic. The citizens longed for security, but resisted the creation of standing armies, relying instead on mercenaries, soldiers of fortune, with no loyalty beyond their pay. Machiavelli distrusted them deeply. In his reports, he argued that Florence needed its own citizen militia. "A city that depends on others for defense," he wrote in one dispatch, "depends also on the fortune of others." Between 1499 and 1500, Machiavelli traveled repeatedly on diplomatic missions throughout Italy and beyond. He visited Bologna, Ferrara, and Rome, gathering intelligence and studying the behavior of rulers. Each court revealed something about the anatomy of power. In the ducal palaces, he saw how decisions were made not by ideals, but by ambition, fear, and necessity. He began to grasp a fundamental truth. The difference between how men ought to act and how they actually act was the key to understanding politics. In 1500, he was sent to France to meet King Louis XIV, who had recently invaded Milan. The journey to the French court was long and filled with observations that would shape his worldview. France represented a new kind of state, centralized, disciplined, and governed by a king whose power rested on both law and arms. Machiavelli admired the French administrative order, noting how authority flowed downward through clear institutions. Compared to the fragile republics of Italy, France seemed invulnerable. The meeting with Louis XIV was brief but revealing. Machiavelli's reports described the king as cautious and methodical, more concerned with maintaining power than with glory. Florence's delegation sought French protection against rival states, but Machiavelli's eyes were on something larger. He saw in France a model of how stability could emerge from discipline and control. Later in The Prince, he would recall this lesson, noting that a ruler must learn to rely on his own arms, not the arms of others. Returning to Florence, he found the Republic still divided between idealists and pragmatists. The ghost of Savonarola lingered. Some still believed that moral purity could sustain a government, while others, like Machiavelli, understood that faith without strength invited ruin. He continued to push for military reform, insisting that only a citizen militia could defend liberty. Though his proposals faced resistance, they reflected his growing conviction that politics was not about virtue alone, but about the practical management of power. During these years, Machiavelli's personal life also began to take shape. In 1501, he married Marietta Corsini, a woman from a respectable Florentine family. Their marriage was modest, and though he loved his wife and children, his passion remained his work. He spent long hours drafting memoranda and writing letters filled with acute observations about human nature. By 1502, his reputation as a skilled diplomat was well established. His superiors now trusted him with missions of greater danger and complexity. The Italian peninsula was once again in turmoil. Cesare Borgia, backed by his father, Pope Alexander VI, had launched a campaign to subdue the small states of central Italy. Ruthless, intelligent and fearless, Borgia became a figure of both admiration and dread across the peninsula. Florence, caught between neutrality and survival, decided to send an envoy to the Duke of Valentinois, Borgia himself. That envoy would be Niccolò Machiavelli. This mission marked a turning point in his life. It would expose him to the raw mechanics of power, the blend of cruelty and intelligence that could hold a state together. As Machiavelli prepared to leave Florence, he could not yet know that the lessons learned from this encounter would one day shape The Prince, his most famous and controversial work. But the stage was set. The Republic had found in him its most brilliant servant, and history had found in him one of its keenest observers. The meeting with Cesare Borgia would test everything he had learned about human ambition, political survival, and the nature of authority. Chapter 3. From 1502 to 1505, The Diplomat and the Encounter with Cesare Borgia. In the autumn of 1502, Niccolò Machiavelli departed Florence on a diplomatic mission that would forever alter his understanding of politics and human nature. His destination was the court of Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, son of Pope Alexander VI, and one of the most feared and fascinating figures of the Italian Renaissance. For the Florentine Republic, this mission was one of survival. For Machiavelli, it became a revelation. The Italy he traveled through was a patchwork of rival city-states and shifting allegiances. Venice, Milan, Florence, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples all competed for dominance, while France and Spain manipulated from afar. Cesare Borgia stood in the center of this chaos, like a storm gathering strength. Backed by French troops and papal wealth, he had embarked on a brutal campaign to conquer the Romagna region, one small state after another falling under his control. His mixture of ruthlessness and charisma made him both admired and feared. When Machiavelli first met Borgia at Urbino, he encountered a man unlike any he had known, tall, confident and calculating, his eyes cold, yet magnetic. He greeted Machiavelli courteously, but every word carried the weight of command. Borgia spoke as if he were shaping destiny itself. To the young Florentine envoy, this encounter was mesmerizing. Here was power stripped of illusion, direct, decisive, and unapologetic. Machiavelli's mission was to maintain Florence's neutrality amid Borgia's conquests. The Republic had no army strong enough to oppose him and no wish to provoke the Pope. Machiavelli's task, therefore, was to observe, report, and survive. He shadowed Borgia's movements for months, sending detailed dispatches back to Florence. Those letters, still preserved, reveal a mind sharpening its understanding of strategy, deception, and leadership. He saw how Borgia combined fear and admiration to command obedience. The Duke rewarded loyalty lavishly, but punished betrayal with precision. When the city of Senigallia rebelled, Borgia invited the rebel commanders to a meeting under the pretense of reconciliation. There, he had them seized and executed on the spot. Machiavelli witnessed this scene with both horror and awe. Men must be either caressed or destroyed, Borgia told his officers, words that would echo decades later in The Prince. The campaign through the Romagna was swift and brutal, but it also revealed Borgia's genius for administration. After subduing the region, he installed able governors and reorganized its laws, turning chaos into order. Machiavelli noted how the Duke knew when to use cruelty to restore peace and when to show mercy to win loyalty. This duality, the calculated use of both the sword and the olive branch, became a central theme in Machiavelli's later thought. Yet beneath Borgia's apparent invincibility lay constant danger. His power depended on the health and favor of his father, Pope Alexander VI, and on the continued alliance with France. Machiavelli saw this fragility clearly. In his dispatches, he observed that even the strongest ruler could fall if his foundations rested on others. He wrote that, "Fortune governs half our actions, but leaves the other half in our hands. For Machiavelli, this was no abstract reflection. It was a truth unfolding before his eyes. During these years, Machiavelli traveled tirelessly across central Italy, negotiating on behalf of Florence while studying the methods of princes. In 1503, he visited Imola and Cesena, two of Borgia's strongholds, where he met Ramiro de Lorqua, one of the Duke's most feared lieutenants. Ramiro was infamous for his cruelty in suppressing revolts, yet Borgia later had him executed and displayed his corpse in the public square. The message was clear. Authority belonged to Borgia alone, and violence was a tool to be used and discarded when convenient. Machiavelli saw in this act the essence of political theatre, the ability to shape perception as well as reality. By 1504, Borgia's dominion had reached its height. His reputation stretched from Rome to Paris, and Florence, though still independent, remained wary. Machiavelli's reports to the Republic were filled with precise details of troop movements, alliances, and betrayals. But between the lines, one can sense his growing admiration. Borgia, for all his ambition and cruelty, embodied the qualities Machiavelli would later define as virtù, courage, decisiveness, and mastery over fortune. In Machiavelli in Hell, historian Roberto Ridolfi describes this period as the moment when the Florentine diplomat looked into the face of power and did not flinch. Indeed, rather than condemning what he saw, Machiavelli sought to understand it. To him, morality in politics was not a matter of personal virtue, but of effectiveness, the ability to maintain order and protect the state. The delicate balance of Italian politics soon began to shift. France's influence wavered, and Pope Alexander's health declined. When the Pope died in 1503, Cesare's fortune collapsed overnight. The new pontiff, Julius II, was Borgia's enemy. Betrayed by the tides of fate, Borgia tried to hold his territories but found himself abandoned by allies and besieged by rivals. Machiavelli, ever the observer, witnessed the speed with which power could vanish when built on unstable foundations. Borgia's fall was as dramatic as his rise. Captured, exiled, and eventually killed in Spain a few years later, he left behind both a legend and a lesson. For Machiavelli, that lesson was profound. Greatness depended not only on strength and intellect, but on the ability to adapt to the unpredictable. Returning to Florence in 1505, Machiavelli was no longer just a bureaucrat. He had become a philosopher of experience. His observations of Cesare Borgia, his brilliance, audacity, and downfall, would become the cornerstone of his political thought. Later, when writing The Prince, he would hold up Borgia as an example of how a ruler might rise through virtù, yet fall through misfortune. Florence welcomed Machiavelli back as a seasoned diplomat. His insights were invaluable in a time of constant tension between republics and monarchies. He continued to advocate for military reform and for the creation of a citizen militia, believing that a free state must defend itself through its own people, not through hired soldiers. Though the Republic had survived another storm, Machiavelli knew its peace was temporary. The Italy he had seen, ambitious, fragmented and vulnerable, was a stage where fortune changed its actors swiftly. Yet in the quiet of his study, one truth had crystallized in his mind. That power, like nature, obeyed its own laws, indifferent to morality or ideals. The young Florentine who once studied Cicero had now walked beside one of the most formidable men of his age. And in doing so, he had discovered the essence of his life's work, the anatomy of power itself. Chapter 4. From 1506 to 1512, the consolidation of a political thinker in the crisis of the Republic. By the year 1506, Niccolò Machiavelli had returned to Florence transformed by his years as a diplomat. He had seen princes rise and fall, armies built and destroyed, and fortune shift without warning. Those experiences had forged in him not only political wisdom, but also a restless determination to apply what he had learned to the survival of his own republic. The Florence he came home to, however, was increasingly fragile, torn between its ideals of liberty and the brutal realities of Italian politics. Machiavelli's first task upon his return was to continue his campaign for military reform. He had long argued that the reliance on mercenaries, foreign soldiers who fought for gold, not loyalty, was the Republic's greatest weakness. Mercenaries could win battles, but never safeguard freedom. He convinced the governing council to authorize the creation of a militia cittadina, a citizen army composed of Florentines themselves. It was an ambitious and controversial idea, but Machiavelli threw himself into it with the same passion that had defined his diplomacy. He personally oversaw the recruitment of farmers and artisans from the surrounding countryside, instructing them in discipline, formation, and loyalty. He studied the tactics of ancient Rome and modeled the militia's organization on the legions of the Republic. His goal was not merely to create an army, but to instill civic virtue, a sense that the defense of Florence belonged to its people, not to hired swords. Many of his contemporaries doubted the project, but Machiavelli's reports to the Chancery reflected growing optimism. He saw in those soldiers the potential rebirth of republican strength. Meanwhile, the balance of power in Italy continued to shift violently. Pope Julius II, the fierce successor of Alexander VI, sought to reclaim papal territories and drive foreign powers from the peninsula. Venice and France maneuvered for influence, and Florence, ever vulnerable, struggled to maintain neutrality. The city was prosperous, filled with merchants and artists, but politically precarious. Machiavelli often traveled between Florence, Pisa, and the Tuscan countryside, organizing defenses and negotiating uneasy truces. In 1507, he accompanied the Florentine troops in their campaign to retake Pisa, a rebellious city that had defied Florence for over a decade. The siege was long and arduous. Machiavelli, though not a soldier, studied every aspect of warfare, the positioning of artillery, the morale of troops, the psychology of command. His dispatches from the front combined the precision of an engineer with the insight of a strategist. He understood that war was not merely a contest of arms, but of will, and that leadership required both firmness and empathy. The campaign ended in 1509 with Florence's victory. Pisa was finally subdued, and Machiavelli's militia had proven its worth. For the first time in years, Florence felt secure. His success earned him respect within the government, and even those who had doubted him began to see him as a man of vision. Yet Machiavelli himself remained cautious. He knew that peace in Italy was an illusion, merely a pause between storms. That same year, France, Spain, and the Papal States formed shifting alliances that plunged Italy into another round of conflict. The League of Cambrai, organized by Pope Julius II, aimed to curb Venetian power, but soon turned into a broader struggle for dominance. Florence found itself once again at the mercy of stronger neighbors. Machiavelli's role grew more complex. He was both strategist and diplomat, balancing defense with negotiation. His observations from this period reveal a deepening philosophical maturity. He began to see politics as governed by patterns, predictable cycles of power and decline driven by human nature. His letters show a mind constantly analyzing, why do states fall? What makes rulers succeed or fail? The answers he sought were not in divine providence, but in the behavior of men, their ambitions, fears, and passions. In 1510, Machiavelli traveled to several courts across Italy, including those of Ferrara and Mantua, as Florence tried to secure alliances. He met diplomats, condottieri, and cardinals, studying how each wielded influence. The duplicity of these men did not disgust him. It fascinated him. He saw politics as a game played according to rules few dared to acknowledge. If one understood those rules, he believed, one could master fortune itself. Back in Florence, he continued to serve tirelessly in the chancery, producing reports, organizing defenses, and advising the Republican government. But tension was mounting within the city. The Medici family, exiled since 1494, sought to return with the support of the Papal States. Pope Julius II, intent on expanding papal influence, viewed the Florentine Republic as an obstacle. In 1511, the Pope's army marched north under the command of his nephew, Giovanni de' Medici. Machiavelli was sent as envoy to the papal camp to negotiate peace, but he quickly realized that diplomacy could no longer save Florence. In a letter from this period, he observed grimly that, when force is joined to fraud, there is no defense but wisdom, and wisdom seldom rules the hearts of men. His words reflected both resignation and clarity. Florence's freedom was slipping away. As the papal army advanced, the Florentine militia tried to resist, but was overwhelmed by professional troops. The Republic's leaders hesitated, paralyzed by fear of retribution. Machiavelli watched in frustration as the ideals he had fought for, civic virtue, self-reliance, republican liberty, crumbled before the realities of power. In 1512, the inevitable occurred. The Medici, aided by papal forces, re-entered Florence in triumph. The Republican government collapsed, and its officials were dismissed or arrested. Machiavelli, who had served faithfully for 14 years, found himself suddenly without position or protection. The man who had navigated the courts of Europe now stood powerless in his own city. Still, those years of service had not been in vain. They had shaped him into one of the sharpest political minds of his age. He had learned from victory and defeat, from courage and cowardice, and though stripped of office, he carried with him the greatest possession of all: experience. Roberto Ridolfi would later describe this phase of Machiavelli's life as the tempering of iron in the furnace of history. He had seen the fragility of republics and the deceit of princes, but beneath his disappointment there remained an unbroken curiosity, a need to understand why men act as they do and how power can be both created and destroyed. As the bells of Florence rang once again for the return of the Medici, Machiavelli's public career came to an abrupt end. Yet his intellectual journey was only beginning. The exile that awaited him would bring humiliation, pain, and, ironically, his most enduring legacy. Chapter 5. From 1512 to 1513, prison, torture, and Machiavelli's exile. When the Medici family returned to Florence in 1512, it marked the end of the Republic and the downfall of those who had served it. For Niccolò Machiavelli, who had devoted 14 years of his life to the Florentine chancery, the change was devastating. The government he had helped to build collapsed overnight, replaced by the old regime that had long viewed him with suspicion. The man who once negotiated with kings and generals now found himself cast out, stripped of office and influence. The city's atmosphere turned heavy with fear and revenge. The Medici, eager to secure their power, began purging the Republic's former officials. Many fled, others went into hiding, and some, like Machiavelli, stayed behind, perhaps out of loyalty, or perhaps because they believed reason would protect them. But in Florence, reason had no voice. In February of 1513, Machiavelli was accused of participating in a conspiracy against the Medici. The alleged plot involved a group of Republican sympathizers who had supposedly planned to overthrow the new regime. Historians still debate whether Machiavelli had any real connection to the conspiracy. There is no evidence that he took part, but his past role as a high-ranking Republican made him a convenient target. Soldiers arrived at his home, arrested him, and dragged him through the streets to the prison of the Bargello, a cold fortress where Florence kept its enemies. There, the man who had once written letters to kings was treated as a traitor. He was interrogated and subjected to the strappado, a form of torture in which the prisoner's hands were tied behind his back, and he was suspended by the wrists until his shoulders dislocated. He endured the agony without confession. His silence was not the defiance of pride, but the endurance of a man who understood that politics had no mercy. In the damp darkness of the Bargello, Machiavelli's thoughts turned inward. The pain had stripped him of illusion, yet his mind remained alive, analyzing even his own suffering. He saw in his imprisonment a reflection of the instability of all human affairs. Fortune, which had once lifted him high, now cast him down, and he knew that what fortune gives, she can take away in an instant. After weeks of confinement, a twist of fate saved him. Giovanni de' Medici, soon to become Pope Leo X, was elected to the papacy, and an amnesty was declared for political prisoners in Florence. Machiavelli was released, bruised and broken, but alive. The city that had once been his stage now felt like a stranger's home. His reputation was ruined, his wealth gone, and his body bore the marks of torture. Yet beneath the humiliation, a new resolve began to form. Banished from politics, he retreated to his small estate in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, a quiet village in the Tuscan hills. There, surrounded by olive trees and silence, Machiavelli entered the most productive period of his life. The man who had lost everything in the public sphere turned his energy toward understanding the world that had destroyed him. His days followed a simple rhythm. In the morning, he worked on his farm, inspecting the vines and talking with peasants. At midday, he visited the local tavern, playing cards and dice with the villagers, listening to their gossip and learning from their unfiltered honesty. But when night fell, he transformed. In a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, written later that year, Machiavelli described his nightly ritual. "When evening comes," he wrote, "I return home and enter my study. I take off my dusty clothes and put on garments fit for a court, and thus properly attired, I enter the ancient courts of men of old. There I am not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reasons for their actions, and they answer me. It was in those nightly conversations with the dead, the philosophers, generals, and rulers of history, that Machiavelli began to distill his experiences into thought. The bitterness of his exile became the soil in which his ideas would grow. The silence of Sant'Andrea was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence before creation. The political world of Florence continued without him. The Medici consolidated their rule, forming alliances with the papacy and France. But while the city turned its gaze toward power, Machiavelli looked toward understanding. He began drafting notes and reflections on what made rulers succeed and fail, observations born not from books, but from life itself. In Machiavellian Hell, historian Roberto Ridolfi notes that this period marked the rebirth of a man who had been destroyed. It was, paradoxically in isolation and disgrace, that Machiavelli became a philosopher. The same mind that had once served the Republic now dissected its collapse with precision and honesty. He found solace in writing, not as a refuge from reality, but as a way to confront it. The pain of betrayal, the memory of torture, and the weight of exile gave his words a raw authenticity. He no longer sought to please the powerful, he sought to understand them. The years of humiliation would soon yield a work that would immortalize his name and forever change the study of politics. But in 1513, Machiavelli could not yet know that. All he knew was that his public life was over. He was 44 years old, a man cast aside by his country. Yet in the solitude of his exile, among his books and his memories, he prepared to write the words that would make him one of the most studied and misunderstood thinkers in history. The fall of the diplomat gave birth to the philosopher. The hands that had once written reports for Florence would soon write for eternity. Chapter 6. From 1513 to 1515, the writing of the prince and the intellectual rebirth. The winter of 1513 in the Tuscan countryside was quiet and cold. From his modest estate in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, Niccolò Machiavelli could look out over the bare vineyards and the faint glow of Florence on the horizon. a city that had exiled him, yet still lived inside his mind. The pain of his imprisonment had faded, but the wound of political defeat remained raw. He was a man without a position, stripped of influence, yet not of intellect. It was here, in isolation and poverty, that Machiavelli began to write the book that would secure his immortality. Each morning he worked on his small farm, supervising laborers, pruning vines, and managing what little remained of his property. The manual rhythm of rural life gave structure to his days. At noon, he walked to the tavern, laughing with peasants, playing cards, and listening to their simple wisdom. To an outsider, he appeared resigned to obscurity. But every evening, when darkness fell, Machiavelli transformed his solitude into a dialogue with history. In his famous letter to Francesco Vettori, dated December 10, 1513, he described the moment with haunting clarity. "When evening comes, I return home and enter my study. On the threshold I take off my muddy clothes, full of the dust of the day, and put on garments fit for a court. Thus decently attired, I step into the ancient courts of men of old, where, being lovingly received, I feed on that food which alone is mine, and for which I was born." These nightly conversations with the ancients, Livy, Tacitus, and Cicero, became the intellectual foundation of his rebirth. From those studies and his years of observation emerged Il Principe, the Prince. Unlike the moral treatises of his time, it was not a sermon on virtue, but a dissection of power itself. Machiavelli wrote not for philosophers, but for rulers. He wanted to show how states were gained, held, and lost. Drawing on his experiences with Cesare Borgia and the fall of the Florentine Republic, he crafted a manual for political survival. Cold, clear, and painfully honest. In the opening chapters, he classified principalities into hereditary and new, explaining how each demanded different forms of governance. His tone was practical, his reasoning surgical. He rejected the idealism that dominated humanist thought. "Many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist," he wrote. "But the way men live is so far from the way they ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation." That sentence alone captured the essence of Machiavelli's realism. To him, politics was not the realm of what should be, but of what is. Morality mattered only insofar as it served stability and power. He was not glorifying cruelty or deception, but recognizing them as inevitable tools in the struggle for survival. The virtuous ruler, in his view, was not the saintly one, but the effective one. At the center of the prince stood two forces, virtu and fortuna. Virtu, not virtue in the Christian sense, but a combination of courage, skill, and strategic intelligence, was the capacity to shape one's fate. Fortuna, the unpredictable flow of chance, was the element of luck or destiny that no man could fully control. A great ruler, Machiavelli argued, must master virtu to command fortuna. His favorite example was Cesare Borgia, who rose to power through talent and audacity, but fell when fortune turned against him. The book was short, written in vigorous, plain Italian rather than the ornate Latin favored by scholars. Its style mirrored its subject, concise, forceful, and direct. In 1515, Machiavelli dedicated the prince to Lorenzo de' Medici, the young ruler of Florence and nephew of Pope Leo X. The gesture was both strategic and desperate. He hoped the work would win him favor and restore him to public service. "If your magnificence will read this little book," he wrote in his dedication, "you will see my great desire that you arrive at that greatness which fortune and your own qualities promise you." But the Medici remained silent. The gift went unacknowledged. The irony was cruel. Machiavelli had written a treatise on power for those in power, yet those very rulers distrusted him. To them, he was still the republican bureaucrat of a fallen government, a man to be watched, not rewarded. Still, The Prince spread quietly among scholars and politicians. Its ideas provoked fascination and fear. Some saw it as a guide to tyranny, others as a mirror reflecting the truth of human affairs. The Church would later condemn it, and the very name Machiavellian would come to mean cunning and deceit. Yet those interpretations missed the core of his message. He was not teaching evil, he was teaching reality. During these years of composition, Machiavelli also began work on another monumental project, the Discourses on Livy, a vast commentary on the history of Rome. While the Prince examined monarchy, the Discourses celebrated the vitality of republics. Together, they formed the two halves of his political vision, the pragmatic art of rule and the enduring spirit of civic liberty. At Sant'Andrea, Machiavelli's evenings became sacred rituals of thought. Surrounded by candlelight and the whisper of wind against the shutters, he wrote with intensity, as though racing against time. Poverty pressed on him, but he refused to surrender to despair. Writing was not only his salvation, it was his act of defiance. Roberto Ridolfi, in the life of Niccolò Machiavelli, observed that exile stripped him of office, but gave him truth. Freed from the compromises of politics, Machiavelli could finally speak openly about what he had seen. His prose carried the authority of experience and the clarity of a man who no longer sought favor. By 1515, the Prince was complete, a slender manuscript that contained one of the boldest statements of political thought in history. Its pages bore the marks of a man who had faced power, suffered under it, and still sought to understand it. Though the world ignored him, Machiavelli had achieved a victory greater than any office could grant. He had turned exile into immortality. From his quiet study in the Tuscan hills, he had redefined the language of politics. And while Florence celebrated its new Medici rulers, a forgotten exile had written the book that would outlive them all. Chapter 7. From 1515 to 1525, the Discourses, the plays, and the history of Florence. By 1515, Niccolò Machiavelli had completed The Prince, a work that distilled his vision of political power with unmatched clarity. Yet despite the brilliance of the treatise, his appeal to the Medici went unanswered. The silence of the ruling family confirmed what he already knew. His career in public service was over, but Machiavelli was not a man to surrender to despair. Freed from the constraints of government, he turned his intellect toward deeper questions: the origins of liberty, the structure of republics, and the eternal cycle of corruption and renewal that governed human societies. He began writing his discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy, known simply as the Discourses on Livy. If The Prince was a manual for rulers, the Discourses was a guide for citizens. In its pages, Machiavelli explored how a free republic could maintain its strength, avoid decay, and foster civic virtue among its people. The work was expansive, blending history, philosophy, and political analysis into a single vision of human order. Drawing upon the example of ancient Rome, Machiavelli argued that conflict, rather than harmony, was the source of liberty. In his eyes, the tension between the nobles and the common people, the grandi and the popolo, was not destructive but vital. It was through struggle that republics renewed themselves. The disunion of the plebs and the Senate, he wrote, kept Rome free. This was a radical idea in an age that still believed in hierarchy and divine order. Machiavelli dared to claim that freedom required friction, that the health of a state depended on its ability to channel human ambition rather than suppress it. While working on the Discourses, he also began writing for the theatre. His comedies, written in the lively vernacular of Florence, revealed another side of his genius, the sharp wit of a man who understood the follies of human behavior. His most famous play, La Mandragola, the Mandrake, completed around 1520, is a darkly humorous tale of deception, lust, and cunning. Beneath its laughter lies the same insight that runs through The Prince, that human desire and manipulation govern the world far more than moral preaching. The play's success surprised even him. Performed before packed audiences, The Mandrake became a sensation. Its realism, its humor, and its daring portrayal of hypocrisy in both church and society reflected the spirit of Florence, brilliant, cynical, alive. Through the stage, Machiavelli reached an audience far broader than scholars and diplomats. The people who once feared his political mind now laughed at his jokes, unaware that each line concealed an observation about their own nature. Yet while his wit entertained Florence, his mind remained fixed on history. Around 1520, Pope Leo X commissioned him to write The History of Florence, a detailed chronicle of the city's rise and decline. The Medici, who had once imprisoned him, now sought his intellect to glorify their lineage. Machiavelli accepted the task not out of civility, but as an opportunity to weave his understanding of politics into the grand narrative of his homeland. For 5 years he labored on the work, consulting archives, interviewing eyewitnesses, and reconstructing centuries of Florentine history. His tone was elegant yet dispassionate. He traced how Florence had evolved from a free commune into a battleground of factions, its ideals of liberty constantly undermined by ambition and fear. To him, the city's story was not unique, but universal. Every state, he believed, followed the same arc: birth, growth, corruption, and renewal. The history of Florence was completed in 1525 and presented to Pope Clement VII, another Medici pope. It was received with admiration and rewarded with payment and respect. After years of exile and disgrace, Machiavelli was once again welcome in the halls of power, though never fully trusted. The same family that had once tortured him now praised his intellect. He accepted their approval without illusion, understanding that politics, like fortune, always turned in circles. During these years, Italy was descending into chaos once more. The balance of power that had maintained relative peace between France, Spain, and the papacy was breaking down. Machiavelli, ever the observer, watched the storm gathering with a mix of fascination and dread. The French army, led by King Francis I, clashed with imperial troops under Emperor Charles V. The Italian states, Florence among them, became pawns in a continental struggle for dominance. Though no longer a diplomat, Machiavelli's correspondence from this period shows that his mind remained alert to every development. He wrote letters filled with analysis and warning, recognizing that Florence's reliance on foreign protection would once again prove fatal. He had seen the same pattern before. Republics that surrendered their defenses soon surrendered their freedom. His writings from these final years reveal a deepening melancholy, though not resignation. He often spoke of the cyclical nature of history, of how nations rose and fell according to the same human impulses: ambition, fear, corruption, and renewal. He no longer believed that men could escape these forces, only that they might understand them and thus suffer less when they returned. Despite the gravity of his thought, Machiavelli never lost his sense of humor or humanity. He remained a beloved guest among Florence's intellectual circles, entertaining friends with stories and witty debates. Those who met him in person were often surprised. The man accused of cynicism was warm, sociable, and quick to laugh. His realism, far from bitter, was born of deep empathy for human weakness. The combination of his works, The Prince, the Discourses, The Mandrake, and the History of Florence, formed a complete portrait of his philosophy. He had written about the art of ruling, the spirit of liberty, the comedy of human desire, and the tragedy of history. Together, they revealed a thinker who saw politics not as an abstract system, but as the living expression of human nature itself. In the summer of 1525, when he presented the History of Florence to Pope Clement, Machiavelli stood once again before the powerful, but he was no longer seeking their favor. He had already achieved what few men ever do. He had seen power from within, endured its cruelty, and understood its laws. Roberto Ridolfi would later write that Machiavelli had become what Florence could never fully recognize, a philosopher born from its own contradictions. In his works, the republic that had exiled him found its most honest historian. The man who once dreamed of saving Florence through action had instead preserved it through memory. His writings captured the essence of his time, the beauty of its art, the brilliance of its intellect, and the ruthless struggle that defined its politics. The next 2 years would bring one final turn of fortune, one last test of faith for the thinker who had dared to describe the world as it truly was. Chapter 8. From 1525 to 1527, the final years and the Republican disillusionment. By 1525, Niccolò Machiavelli had reached his mid-50s, a man seasoned by war, diplomacy, disgrace, and reflection. His history of Florence had restored a measure of respect, but not the power or recognition he once enjoyed. He moved between Florence and the countryside, advising on minor military matters and corresponding with old friends. His mind remained sharp, his curiosity alive, but the Italy around him was collapsing into chaos. The balance of power that had defined the Italian Renaissance was gone. The long rivalry between France and the Holy Roman Empire had erupted into total war. The peninsula, once the glittering heart of Europe, was now a battlefield. In May of 1527, the unthinkable happened. Imperial troops under Emperor Charles V marched into Rome, looting the Eternal City in what became known as the Sack of Rome. The event shocked all of Christendom. Churches were desecrated, cardinals humiliated, and thousands killed. For Machiavelli, who had spent his life studying power, it was a grim vindication of his beliefs. The gods of idealism had fallen before the iron laws of necessity. Florence, too, felt the tremors. The Medici, tied to the papacy, found their rule weakened. Republican exiles began to return, calling for the restoration of liberty. After nearly 15 years of silence, the spirit of the old republic stirred again. Machiavelli, despite his complicated history with both sides, longed to serve. He still believed in Florence, not in its rulers, but in its people, and in the idea of a free city governed by reason. In the spring of 1527, the Florentine Republic was re-established. The Medici were expelled once more, and the familiar cry for freedom echoed through the streets. For Machiavelli, it should have been a moment of redemption. After years of exile and disgrace, he hoped to be recalled into service, to help rebuild the state he had once defended. But when his name was proposed for a government position, suspicion flared. Many Republicans still distrusted him, seeing in him the shadow of his past collaboration with the Medici. The rejection cut deeply. After a lifetime devoted to Florence, Machiavelli found himself an outcast once more, this time not because of tyranny, but because of liberty. He wrote bitterly to friends, confessing that the ingratitude of men hurt more than the cruelty of princes. "The people," he observed, "forget more quickly the loss of liberty than the loss of comfort." It was not cynicism, but a sad recognition that human nature, not ideology, shaped history. Amid these disappointments, his health began to fail. The long years of stress, travel, and imprisonment had taken their toll. In early summer, while staying near Florence, he fell ill with severe stomach pains. His condition worsened over several weeks, leaving him too weak to write. Even in sickness, his mind wandered to politics. Friends who visited him reported that he still spoke of the Republic's future and of how fortune never ceased to test the courage of men. As his strength faded, he turned inward. Those who knew him said he faced death with calm dignity, speaking of life as one more campaign, a battle between reason and chance. He died on June 21, 1527, in his modest home in Florence. He was 58 years old. His body was laid to rest in the Church of Santa Croce, the resting place of Italy's greatest thinkers and artists. Centuries later, an inscription would be carved upon his tomb, Tanto nomini nullum par elogium. No praise is equal to such a name. In the years immediately following his death, Machiavelli's reputation became the subject of fierce debate. To some, he was a patriot who had sought to understand power to preserve liberty. To others, especially within the church, he was a dangerous thinker whose realism bordered on heresy. His books were placed on the index of forbidden works, and his name became synonymous with cunning and deceit. Yet his ideas continued to circulate, copied, debated, and feared. Even his enemies could not ignore him. His contemporaries misunderstood him because he refused to lie about human nature. He did not worship virtue, nor did he glorify vice. He simply described the world as it was, not as people wished it to be. In doing so, he laid the foundations of modern political science. Centuries later, philosophers from Hobbes to Rousseau, from Nietzsche to Gramsci, would find in his writings the raw material for their own theories of power and morality. Machiavelli's final years were not triumphant, but they were true to his character, lucid, unyielding, and devoted to truth. His disillusionment with both princes and republics did not make him bitter, it made him wise. He saw in human behavior an unchanging rhythm, ambition followed by excess, excess by ruin, and ruin by renewal. The republic that had rejected him would fall again, but his ideas would endure long after the walls of Florence crumbled. In the centuries that followed, the prince would be read by emperors and revolutionaries alike, by Napoleon, Mussolini, Lenin, and Churchill. Some used it as a manual, others as a warning, but all recognized in it the mind of a man who had seen the world without illusions. Machiavelli had not sought to corrupt politics. He had only stripped away its masks. As historian Roberto Ridolfi wrote, "He gave politics its soul back, not by sanctifying it, but by revealing it." The exile who once wandered the hills of Tuscany had reshaped the way humanity thought about power, freedom, and fate. His words, written in solitude, would outlast the princes he served, the popes who condemned him, and the republics that forgot him. In the quiet of the Church of Santa Croce, where sunlight still falls on his tomb, the spirit of Niccolò Machiavelli seems to whisper the truth that defined his life, that power, virtue, and fortune are but reflections of the same restless human heart. The historical reconstruction of Machiavelli's life and works draws primarily from two authoritative biographies by Roberto Ridolfi, The Life of Niccolò Machiavelli and Machiavelli in Hell. These works provide meticulous detail on his diplomatic missions, exile, and intellectual evolution, offering a balanced portrait of the man behind the prince and the discourses on Livy. And so ends our story. If you enjoy histories like this one, subscribe to Bioworld Legends. Thank you for watching. Here are 2 more videos you'll love. Join us there, and let's continue exploring the lives that shaped our world.